Welcome to Natural Habitat Adventures Daily Dose of Nature. Today's topic, all about night photography, auroras, stars, and more, presented by NatHab Expedition Leader Court Whelan. I'm your host, Rob Bess. Thank you so much for being here with us today. Court, take it away.
Hey, thanks, Rob, and thanks everyone for joining today. I love this topic. I love night photography. As you may know, I love all photography, wildlife, travel, you name it, but there's something about night photography that gets me particularly excited to go out that night and photograph because it's about the process, it's about the planning. You know you're gonna get something. With wildlife, it's great. You have these settings, you're flexible, you're spontaneous, but there's this whole other set of process when it comes to night photography, particularly aurora, stars, and other night scenes. So I love it. I hope you already love it or will start to love it by way of this presentation and the teachings that I have for you today. But I also have to say that it's a very challenging type of photography. It is one of the more difficult things to do and to nail right. So I've got a lot of slides today. We're going to do a very deep dive. So without further ado, I'm going to launch into it. And what are we really talking about here? Well, the gist is, of course, capturing beautiful night scenes. But from a technical side, the challenge here is that you have very, very long exposure photography, which turns the whole camera system on its head compared to other types of photography in daytime hours, like wildlife, like travel, like other landscapes. And the gist is you are trying to let in a lot of light from a very, very dark scene. And we all know it's dark, but also keep in mind that when we are out in nighttime settings, our eyes are adjusting millisecond to millisecond to perceive more light in darkness. But the camera is just a digital instrument, and so it has to take that time to record to let in a lot of light. So that's really the crux of it is how do you let in a ton of light while getting focus, while getting interesting elements in your scene? And we're really boiling this down today into astrophotography. Um, and we're also going to be getting into aurora borealis or northern lights photography. But the great thing is even if you're not planning on photographing stars or photographing the aurora anytime soon, and you just really want to learn some tips on how to photograph in nighttime settings, Northern lights photography and astrophotography are the most challenging of the night photography. So these lessons are going to be great for setting you up for any sort of night photography you're getting into. And we're also going to be getting into a little couple fun snippets of things like moon photography. I'm going to tell you how to photograph the moon. General night scenes. What are the considerations? So as I always like to start off these talks, let's talk about the gear needed for this type of photography. And this is kind of like the standard slide I show for the various types of camera systems out there. But I will say right off the bat that because of letting in so much light, you're very much going towards the DSLR mirrorless type, and the bridge camera will work quite well. But it is something where the bigger the better the camera, the better the shots, the easier it's going to be to get these types of low light settings. That all being said, you absolutely can do it on a point and shoot, and smartphones are actually getting extraordinarily good at night photography. So we're going to start off with a little bit of just kind of snippets here of what you might want to think about if shooting on an iPhone or a smartphone. There are a few apps out there, and the most prominent app that I've found recently that I actually really, really love is the Leica camera app. It's a free app that turns your camera well, kind of into a Leica camera, which if you know anything about them, they're very nice, very fancy, but it reconfigures all the settings and the pixels to just kind of give it that Leica look. But what I'm telling you here, the reason I'm telling you about the Leica app here is because it's a good, easy way to get into custom settings in your iPhone. Most smartphones don't let you dial in very specific settings. They just kind of assume you want to do everything full auto. Um, and frankly, it actually works pretty darn well. If you're on one of the later iPhones or one of the later Google Pixels, the Androids, etc., most of the time you can just point your iPhone in a night setting. It'll give you some sort of prompt to hold your camera, your phone still, and you'll be amazed at the photo that comes out of it. But these are some other apps that back in the day were required when iPhones didn't do it right outside the box or the Leica app didn't exist. But I do really like the Leica, especially even for daytime stuff, travel photography. It just makes photos look absolutely beautiful on the smartphones. If you are shooting on a point and shoot, you can do most of the same manual settings that I'm going to be telling you about for the majority of this presentation, but they do have an auto mode if you wish to cut out the shutter speed and aperture and ISO and just go straight to reconfiguring your camera to maximizing for low light photography. Generally, there's some sort of night mode on your camera. So it behooves you, if you are on some sort of point and shoot, to find that and then use that if you don't wish to switch to full manual. But you will hear the majority of this presentation talk about manual settings. Definitely don't want to overwhelm, and it's actually a pretty specific recipe from shot to shot. But manual, in terms of the settings, is the way to go. Not necessarily manual focus. We'll talk about that in a second, but the manual settings are the way to go. If you have a bigger, fancier camera like I do, these are the considerations we're talking about. So whatever camera body you have, full frame is going to be a better option. They're more of like the professional types of cameras. They're a little bit more money. They're a little bit bigger. They are more sturdier made, but the biggest thing is that they have a bigger sensor in them, so they handle low light significantly better. The sensor is by square area almost double the size. Um, Tripod, 100% required for all these things, except for maybe an iPhone. But if you did have an iPhone, tripod's going to make it even better. But tripod, I'm not even going to spend a lot of time talking about that unless I get questions about specific tripods or specific tripod heads. We can address those on a case-by-case basis, but some sort of stabilization, a good sturdy tripod is an absolute must. But let's spend a minute or two talking about lenses. So if you have what's called a kit lens, KAT, that just basically means the lens that your camera kit came with. They're usually something like an 18 to 55 or a 24 to 105. Those are going to be okay. However, if you want to go towards, more high-end, more defined astrophotography, northern lights photography, it is going to behoove you to think about better lenses. And this is a great instance where I really, really recommend, really advocate people, if you are going on a northern lights photo trip, or if you are going on one of our canyons trips in the summer or in the fall, well, spring, any time of year, and you do wish to get those dark sky photos, getting a dedicated astrophotography or northern lights lens is really, really valuable and beneficial. I'm going to spend a little bit of time talking about the pros and cons of those two lenses in the bottom right, not those exact brands, but those classes of lenses. You essentially have one that is really, really fast, like that f1.4 lets in a ton of light, but 24 millimeters is not super duper wide. You have an 18, or sorry, a 16 to 35, pretty fast, but very, very wide. You might want one of those depending on if you're trying to focus on astrophotography versus northern lights. And we're going to get into a little bit of a deeper dive on that. I don't want to overwhelm you just right off the bat, but we're going to go through a few specific examples here later in the presentation. Moving on to other types of gear, what else might you need for nighttime photography? Well, a smartphone is really good for a few reasons. I'm going to actually give you some apps here in a second to map dark skies, find the darkest area of your neighborhood, neighborhood being metaphorical. It's not literally going to say turn left to the fire hydrant and that's the darkest spot, but more like, hey, if you're in the western states and you go to this national park, that's going to be your darkest sky. It's also a good flashlight, and it also allows you to track where the Milky Way might be if you can't see it with your naked eyes. So smartphones are really, really great beyond just taking a photo with your smartphone. I really do recommend a headlamp and preferably with a red light. The reason red light is so important is that it preserves your night vision. A lot of astro and northern lights and other nighttime photography, we want to keep our eyes adjusted to quote unquote see in the dark. We want to be able to see the stars in the Milky Way. If you're constantly turning on a bright white light to look at your settings or to look at your footing, it's going to reset your eyes really, really quickly, and you're going to lose that hour plus of wonderful dark vision that you've acquired by being patient and sitting out there in the dark looking at stars. It also helps other photographers so you're not blasting white light across their scene if you're with a group of photographers. But you might also consider a strong flashlight, like a proper one that would illuminate, allowing you to do light painting, or maybe allow you to achieve focus. We'll talk about that in a second. And then the other two things in the upper left-hand corner here would be for some ambient light or more intentional light drawing or light painting. That thing in the upper left-hand corner, they can be really inexpensive on B&H or Amazon, and it's essentially just a controllable, dimmable light box that allows you to very, very softly illuminate hillsides, or like you'll see some photos here, tents or hoodoos, where you don't want a big, strong light. Like you can almost barely even see the light with your naked eye, but it's just enough with these long exposures, like we're going to talk about, to do a really good job. And then that little keychain light is great for the light painting and drawing, like you're going to see here in a few slides. So these would be what I'd bring with me on my astro or night photography trip. Okay, so we're going to start the presentation with astrophotography, okay? And let's begin with where to go. And here is that app I've been talking about. The trick is to go, there's sort of three levels here of how to photograph really good stars at night. And to be totally honest, when I say really good stars, I really mean like finding the Milky Way, because that's the holy grail, that's the pièce de résistance, that's what you want to photograph. Of course, any stars can be quite good, and we'll show some examples here, but no matter what type of astrophotography you're doing, the first thing is getting away from light. So you can go to this website, you can download an app even for your iPad or for your phone, and you can find these areas that are particularly good with limited light pollution. So that's kind of an obvious. These next two things are a little bit less known, but perhaps even more important, is that you need to find some elevation and you need to find some dryness. Now, the reason for that is that under about 4,000 feet of elevation, you have a lot of water vapor in a lot of places. Like oftentimes I'll go to these really secluded islands on some of our expeditions, and you think, gosh, we must be 500 miles, 1,000 miles away from the closest big city or light source. Why are we not seeing the stars like we would in Bryce Canyon National Park? Well, it's probably because it's so humid and all that marine layer, that water vapor is just sort of clouding our vision. So yes, it's really dark, but the humidity mixed with being sea level can be kind of troublesome. And then that goes to say that the dryness is also really important too. So when we look at places like the Grand Canyon, like Bryce Canyon National Park, like the national parks of the West, we tend to find some of the darkest spots mixed with being 6, 7, 8,000 feet of elevation, and then quite dry. And then that mixture gives you what you're looking for. It gives you that beautiful Milky Way. It gives you the clear stars, really great ability to see into the heavens. Another thing to look for in location. Again, I personally think that the Milky Way is really one of the most magnificent parts of night sky photography. You can certainly convince me otherwise, and I've seen lots of beautiful photos that don't have the Milky Way, but let's just kind of start there. Is using some sort of app on your phone. So like I mentioned, the phone is really useful for lots of different things when photographing the night sky. The Star Walk app is one that I particularly like. And all you have to do is sort of calibrate it. It syncs up with GPS, so you don't even have to have service. Obviously, when we're talking about some of these remote places, good luck getting a Wi-Fi signal. But a lot of these apps will cue into GPS, and then you can literally hold your phone into the night sky, and you can figure out where the Milky Way is, and that's where to point your camera, your tripod. That's where to set up. So this is really quite helpful. Then sort of the last piece of the puzzle is the seasonality of the Milky Way. And this is something that, you can photograph the Milky Way at any time of year, but if you have been out numerous years or numerous months and found that it's easier and harder depending on the trip, depending on the time of year, you're exactly right. And so this is a little bit of a cheat sheet of how easy it is to see the Milky Way based on what time of year. Now, this is very, very specific for, well, I shouldn't say very, very specific. It's moderately specific to where you're at location wise. Like if we're in the southern hemisphere or we're way off the average, it's not exactly perfect. But this is based on roughly 40 degrees north, which is kind of like a northern middle cross section of the US. So it's great for a lot of places in the US. So you can kind of look at this if you are photographing in the US and southern Canada as the guide. And what you'll see here is it's not so much that the Milky Way isn't visible at other times of year. It's primarily of what time of night it's going to be visible. And so, yes, if you're in April and you're able to stay up till 4 a.m. or maybe wake up really early, you do have that chance. But you'll notice that sometimes the actual daylight is going to play around with you. So in general, what this all boils down to is that the summer months in general in the US, in southern Canada, are some of the best months to see and photograph the Milky Way. So what else are you going to look for great night photography? I'm kind of getting slightly away from the Milky Way here because that could be part of the scene, but it doesn't always have to be. But another really strong component that you really want to think about no matter what's going on with the stars, is some sort of landscape feature. Yes, the stars are amazing, but if you don't have something interesting in the foreground, like a person, a structure, a building, hoodoos, like here in Bryce Canyon National Park, a nice trail, it's just going to fall a little flat. It's not going to have the context. You do need some sort of subject. And it could truly be almost anything. This is just some scraggly tree at a campsite. I think I was here in Moab, and it doesn't have to be much, but it really ought to be something. And it could even be that you really, really want to showcase the night sky, and all you have is the horizon. Well, that's great. Just put a small sliver in the bottom. But if you're only photographing the Milky Way or the stars, and it just looks like the whole screen, the whole photo is nothing but dots of light, without that context, it just doesn't put the viewer of your photo in that space. It doesn't give them that understanding of like, oh yeah, this is the stars. We must be out camping in the West. So I really, really highly recommend having some sort of subject, some sort of focal point. And it could even be setting up your own props. I have brought with me before tents that I don't even plan to sleep in, because or a second tent where I have one set up, but then I have a prop tent that I'll set. This is not one of those, of course. I was sleeping in this one, but having some sort of prop, a tent that's lit from the inside, is a great way to get some really, really cool night shots. Okay, so I can't overstate that enough that having some sort of subject, it could be a person, it could be a structure, it could be a bush, it could be a mountain. It's really, really important for star photography, astrophotography. Okay, let's now get into settings. Okay, so you're seeing the screen here with some of this is basically my recipe. I'm going to go through it line by line of sort of why for each of these. So the top left, you'll see I'm in manual mode. This means that I am setting my aperture, shutter speed, and ISO. If you're not used to shooting in manual, it might be a little bit daunting at first, but it's really just three things you have to set. And you can look in your camera's manual. You can go on the camera manufacturer's website and figure out which dial and which wheel to turn to get these things. But once you get used to it, it becomes second nature. The first thing is your aperture. This is essentially the opening of your camera or your lens to let in light to the sensor, and you're trying to let in as much light as humanly possible. This is where getting a lens that is f2.8 or 1.4 is going to be absolutely paramount. And just from years of experience doing this, even though 2.8, if you're familiar with these terms and aperture and fancier cameras, even though 2.8 is considered a really great, a really big aperture rating, a really big aperture number, f1.4 lets in 4 times as much light, and it is significantly better, particularly for astrophotography. You're going to see when we switch over to Northern Lights here in a second that f1.4 really doesn't play as much of a part. 2.8 is just fine, even f4 is just fine. But again, from a lot of experience, to get that brightness out of the Milky Way, out of the stars, out of the sky at night, you really need to get the fastest, quote unquote, fastest lens possible. So I really, really do advocate for buying or renting something that is 1.4. And we'll talk a little bit more about those lenses here in a second. I'm going to compare that with Northern Lights lenses. So shutter speed, this is how long your sensor is open to light. And the reason I say 25 seconds is because that's really the longest you can go before you start getting something called star trails. So what happens is when your shutter is open that long, believe it or not, the rotation of the Earth, it's actually moving fast enough, believe it or not, that if you have your shutter open 30, 35, 40 seconds, a minute, to let in even more light, like you think you would, those star trails begin to move because the Earth is moving enough. And there's a great rule to figure out the maximum you can go with your shutter speed because you really want to go as long as humanly possible. It's called the 500 rule. And essentially you divide 500 by the focal length of your lens. And that gives you a pretty good idea of how long you can go before you start seeing those star trails. So as you can imagine, if you have a big telephoto lens, it's much shorter because you're zoomed into those stars and it's easier to see the movement. The wider the lens, the less definition on each star, the less part of the frame individual stars take up. So you can get away with a much longer exposure. Another reason why those 24 millimeters and as you'll see in a little bit, the 14 millimeter lenses are really top notch for astrophotography. And then ISO is really just a means to an end. we don't want a high ISO. We would love ISO 100, 200, 300, 400, but usually because of how dim the lighting conditions are, your aperture can only open up so much. You can only open your shutter or lengthen your shutter to about 25 seconds before you start seeing those little star trails. We will talk about intentional star trails here in a second, but the little tiny ones that are they make them look like little worms. It's just very, very distracting. You do want relatively pinpointed focused stars. So usually the ISO, I tend to start at 3200, maybe even 6400 these days because these cameras are getting so darn good at high ISOs. Like I can shoot at ISO 12,800, and then with a little denoising software in Lightroom, it turns out a beautiful photo. And then what I do is I sort of back off that and I come down to lower and lower ISOs, just to get a variety of shots. Okay. So those are the three main, like the trifecta: aperture, shutter speed, ISO. Those are relatively non-negotiable. Obviously, we just talked about a little bit of variability and experimentation, but those are kind of non-negotiable. This is a little bit more artistic, a little bit more practical stuff here, other camera settings. What I like to do personally, remember I have my camera on a tripod, is I like to set the shutter at a 2 second timer. So this is akin to like the 10-second timer if you were to take a photo and go run in the group of your friends or family and be in the photo you're taking with a 10-second timer. A 2 second just does 2 seconds, and then what that essentially does is it allows your camera to stabilize again after you press that button before it starts and before it sets the sensor for being open, before it actually takes the photo. And the problem is if you don't have this on and push the shutter, that little bit of movement, you don't think it's much, but a little bit of movement as you press that shutter can actually blur slightly because you do need incredible stability here. I generally go for auto white balance for nighttime photography with the plan to 100% toy with it and mess with it in Lightroom or Photoshop afterwards. We'll talk about that in a little bit. Stabilization, this is something a lot of people forget, but if you are on a tripod, you should 100% turn any sort of image stabilization off, because oftentimes what it'll do is the image stabilizer will try to compensate for it. It doesn't know what it's doing, doesn't realize it's stable, and you will get a little bit of movement. So if you've ever been really frustrated with blurred nighttime photos, even though you're on a perfectly stable tripod, you might have your image stabilizer turned on and it should be off. And then again, sort of a matter of preference, but I highly recommend shooting raw files because you are going to want to edit these for maximum effect afterwards. And raw files, as we know, are infinitely more editable than the JPEG variation. Okay, so that's all kind of easy. You can find some cool places, find some dark places. You dial in those settings. Don't go too far outside the box of what I'm telling you. But focusing can be quite challenging. I would say, frankly, this is probably one of the hardest parts of any sort of nighttime photography. So this is the recipe that I do. There are other variations, and in fact, on our Natural Habitat Adventures photo tutorial website, I just wrote an article on some of the other variations, so I'll point you to that and give you the address after this presentation. But essentially, this is what I do, is I go with a center point autofocus. So only the dead middle of my frame has that square. That's where, when I press my shutter halfway, that's what's going to be in focus. And then what I do is I will shine using my strong flashlight that I recommend you bring on whatever my subject is. So it could be a hillside a little bit far away. It could be the person standing in front that I want focused. And that light on that subject is going to allow my autofocus to work. If you don't have light on that and expecting to focus on a dark hill with a dark sky in the background, remember, the camera is picking up this light in the sky. It doesn't, the eyes are not seeing the sky that bright. This is after a 25-second exposure. If you're relying on focus on a dark hill with a dark sky, it's probably not going to focus. So using that strong flashlight is a really, really great tool. That locks in focus. Then what you want to do is switch to manual focus on your lens. What that does is that locks in that autofocus, so you don't have to touch your lens anymore for that shoot. Make sure you don't focus on the external ring, like don't refocus, don't touch it, don't bump it. But what it does, that allows you to take different compositions. You can go left to right, up to down. As long as you don't move your tripod by much, you now have focus locked and focus is no longer a concern. Then you just get to be creative with the shutter speed, with the ISO, with the composition, maybe even in camera playing around with different white balance settings. Although I do a lot of that in Lightroom, that's all the variation that you can do. But you don't have to worry about focus, which is fantastic. And remember, last step, do not touch the focusing ring unless you do move and you say, great, I got this shot, and we move further down the trail. You set your lens back to autofocus and redo this whole process. But while you're photographing in that spot, you don't have to worry about focus. It's a really, really great thing. Okay, so light painting. This is also sort of challenging. It's how do you get great night photos without everything being silhouetted? I would say for starters, embrace the silhouette. The silhouette looks beautiful. It's great. This is definitely a more advanced, this is a more challenging technique. But even in one night of photographing in Bryce Canyon, in Asalo National Park, Madagascar, wherever you might be headed to photograph stars, in one night you can learn a lot and you can go from beginner to advanced. And this is a really nice tool to try to get some really advanced looking shots. So what I have here is on this cliffside, I just have this little light box at very, very dim setting, just painting that light on the side. Again, it's not a flash, it's not a burst of light, just a little bit of light on some of the lowest settings with a 25-second exposure is going to bring out just a little bit of contrast, just a little bit of texture. It's going to add a little bit of light to that cliff over there, which I think, turns what could have been a silhouetted shot into something even more beautiful. So traditional light painting, at least what many people think of it is more akin to this. So this is someone with a long exposure writing the word Alaska with that little keychain light over the course of about 25 seconds. And it's much easier if I were to tell you how to do this in the field. If you join one of our Northern Lights trips, we like to do a lot of this sort of stuff. But essentially, if the person writing this word writes it over the course of 25 seconds, meaning don't write it in 2 seconds and then go away. But if you're really diligent to take that 25-second exposure and write that word, this can come out. And it's actually really quite fun. Another type of light painting, this is something that you can safely, safety is priority. You can do at home, and if you have a big backyard or something. And this is a really great way to creatively practice the techniques I'm talking about here. And all you need to do here is you take a metal whisk, like something you mix pudding with or something, get a little bit of steel wool. You light that steel wool on fire with just a normal candle lighter, attach it to a string. I know if you haven't seen this, you probably think I'm absolutely crazy by now, but this truly does work. A string, and as you swirl it around, this steel wool actually burns into sparks, and it kind of creates this really, really interesting ring effect scene. And this can be done sort of anywhere, and it makes just for a fun little evening, nighttime hobby if you're looking to advance your own nighttime photography skills, because the skills need to take this kind of photo, same setting, same technique as everything else, but if you don't have northern lights in your own backyard, if you don't think the Milky Way is overhead, or if you're in a brighter city, this is a great way to have some fun creatively in your own space. So I didn't want to move on from astrophotography without talking about star trails. It's pretty simple. I personally don't do a whole lot of it because it does keep your camera locked up for a long amount of time. But I do at least want to tell you how to do it if you're in one of these places, and experimenting, doing trial and error, and trying this is certainly a great option, especially if you're camping and you have all night outside, something like that. Essentially, what you want to do is you want to use all the same settings I was talking about. So, f1.4 or f2.8, ISO 1600, something like that. But instead of having the shutter speed be 25 seconds, you're going to go into your camera's menu system. You may need to go into the manual as well to figure this out as to exactly where this lives. But every camera is going to have what's called a bulb setting, BULB. And sometimes the setting, instead of saying, 10 seconds or 20 seconds, it just says B. You might be wondering, what in the world does B stand for? Well, B means your shutter just stays open until you hit the button again to close it. So it's an infinite exposure. It's not 10 or 20 seconds. It's however long between the off and on, or the on and off, when you hit that shutter. And as you can see here, I have a note that I had this open for about an hour. And that's how long it takes to get some really nice star trails intentionally. The key thing, in addition, is, because you sort of want the swirling around a singular axis point, I've done a lot of this where I can't see the North Star, and it just doesn't look all that good. The stars are just kind of moving in the sky, and there isn't that singular axis and rotation. So finding the North Star via a star app is really, I think, an integral part of this. I'm not going to go on too long because it's not my favorite type of nighttime photography, but it is fun to do. It's fun to experiment with, and it's fun to have in your repertoire. Okay, we are shifting on to northern lights. So photographing the northern lights, you're going to see some similarities, some differences, and I'd be very keen to point those out to you. So the first thing, finding northern lights is quite different than finding great astrophotography areas. If you've seen any of my northern lights presentations, you may have heard and seen this before, but basically the aurora is a ring around geomagnetic North Pole. It is not such that if you go further and further north towards the North Pole, they get better and better. There's actually a very specific ring that has to do with something called the Van Allen radiation belts, where magnetic field lines actually dip down because the Earth is essentially a magnet. They dip down and they carry the solar wind from the sun down, where oxygen and nitrogen particles are bombarded in the atmosphere. So none of that's going to be on the test, but it's to tell you that it's actually pretty predictable as to where you need to go. And there's some great websites. If you just Google Aurora Forecast or Aurora Forecast app, there are now a couple dozen different options, and they're all pretty good. But notice how this ring, if you know where Arctic Canada is, or specifically if you know where Churchill, Canada is, where I guide our Northern Lights trips, you're going to notice it's right smack dab in the middle of that ring. So shameless plug, but of course Churchill is no doubt my favorite place on the planet to photograph Northern Lights. There are many other places. Iceland's a great one too. The trouble with Iceland is that it's surrounded by a warm, relatively warm ocean, like liquid water when the ground is frozen in the winter, and it does tend to provide some more clouds than an interior spot when you have a frozen bay and mostly landmass surrounding you. So this is not my time to tell you all the places in the world to photograph aurora, but there are very specific places. Fairbanks, Alaska could be another one. It's kind of just on the fringe of that zone in this image here, but certainly Churchill is one of my favorites. And then capturing them could be in any which way, shape, or form. But the number one thing I'm going to recommend, you're probably seeing and thinking about my lessons with astrophotography here, is something besides just the aurora. Remember, something besides just the stars, just the Milky Way. They are beautiful on their own, but when you have some sort of foreground element, it really elevates it. And there's no rule in exactly what type of foreground element. Here we have a traditional Métis teepee at Dave's dog yard here. It's actually lit up on the inside by a little fire. That makes a foreground element. We have a traditional Inukshuk on the edge of Hudson Bay. That's a beautiful foreground element. So you see there's more and more layers to the photo. Yes, the northern lights are great. Yes, the snowy ground is great, but there's something even cooler, or at least there's something additional for the eye to focus on to then reveal the rest of the surroundings, making it really a top level photo. Okay, so we're getting into settings here for Northern Lights. Now, the thing is I started off with probably the most restrictive of the settings when I talk about astrophotography. They are the least flexible because you have to have so much light to capture stars and so much light to capture Milky Ways. So, or the Milky Way. There aren't plural Milky Ways, I don't think. Last time I checked the galaxy, but nevertheless, you'll notice right off the bat that we're not as restricted. We're not as desperate for that really big aperture or that really small f number. So now all of a sudden, phones work quite well with Aurora. Point and shoots can work well. Your basic kit lens with your sort of introductory DSLR, they can all work really well because we're really just looking for an aperture of 2.8, and I've shot for many years at aperture f4, and you get great Aurora still. Notice the shutter is much more flexible. We're dealing with something between 5 and 20 seconds. And even ISO, there are many times where the Aurora can be so bright, I'm having to dial my ISO down to restrict the amount of light coming into the scene. So remember here, we're back on, or we're still on manual mode. We definitely want to be on manual mode. And I'll just walk through the middle one there, which is that shutter speed. Why might we not want to keep our shutter open as long as humanly possible? Well, sometimes when the aurora streams overhead, it actually is quite bright. And if you keep your shutter open too long, and you don't committently adjust your aperture or ISO, you actually might get too many highlights and the aurora might just be blown out. You might lose definition, you might lose color. But equally important, when the aurora is really kicking, like it is here and like it is in this next photo I'll show you, it's actually streaming across the sky like a curtain. And if you let your shutter open too long, it'll just be like a really, really diffuse, full green sky versus having those really discrete, specific bands. Like notice how in this photo there's some definition to the movement of the aurora. Look at this next shot. You can see it's streaming across the sky. So oftentimes when the aurora is really kicking, I might start at 20 seconds, but steadily dial lower, lower and lower and lower, because believe it or not, you actually have to shoot kind of fast to freeze. I'm doing air quotes here, freeze in motion of the aurora when it's really active. So other things, again, kind of a mirror image from astrophotography, but super important. I really love the 2 second timer. This is a good time to kind of talk about remote shutter doohickeys, buttons, like the little accessories you can buy from your camera manufacturer. They're great too. I have nothing against them. I have one myself. I find that when I'm out photographing, even if it's in mild weather, Bryce Canyon for astro, but especially when I'm in places like Churchill or Iceland for aurora, and it's cold and it's dark and I'm kind of out of my element, I just want simplicity. So yes, a remote shutter works just fine. It might be a little bit easier in some cases, but it also might be a little bit harder in some cases when your Bluetooth won't connect, when you find um, the remote's battery died, when you didn't update the firmware, all these kind of things that I know you're probably familiar with other tech. So I like going simplicity. That's why I need 2 second timer. Auto white balance, again, because I totally intend to change it. Stabilizer off and shoot in raw files. So very similar settings here for focus. I'm going to use this time not to repeat this list like you've just heard for Astro, but to tell you about a different style and maybe a little bit as to why I don't use it or why I use it with caution. So again, these settings, this way to focus is my preferred method, but you might be thinking this already, you can set your lens to manual and you can dial all the way to infinity. Now, you would think if you dial your focus to infinity, which would be the opposite rotation of the minimum focusing distance, so now it's the maximum, you'd think that an aurora that's 70 miles away or stars that are millions of miles away, that's infinity, right? Well, when they said infinity, they really meant infinity. So you actually have to, if you dial all the way to infinity, you actually have to pull it back a little bit, or else things will be entirely blurred. Infinity is truly beyond the stars. So what a lot of photographer buddies of mine do that use this technique is they'll actually use a Sharpie marker or a piece of tape and draw, doing lens tests of exactly where that focus should be, how much they need to pull back that infinity focus. And you'll be surprised that sometimes it's like a millimeter or a fraction of a millimeter. And so that's why when I'm in cold conditions, when it's kind of hectic and I'm excited and I've got big mittens on, I don't tend to go that way. I don't tend to do the manual infinity focusing technique, but it absolutely is a viable way. But this, as you see on screen here, is my preferred method. Okay, possible variations. So kind of similar to Astro, but let's go over these. So new composition. The aurora, when it's kicking, it could be around for hours, it could be around for minutes. You never really know. So you want to take photos, take photos, take photos. So I'm constantly doing new compositions. Because of the way I autofocus and make sure that my foreground element is intact sharp focus, I will take all the possible composition variations when I'm in a single spot before moving on. Like I'm not super frenetic, like running over to this side of the forest and then back to the cabin over here and then over by the vehicle here. I'm really trying to get like, how can I see a single scene in 5 or 6 different ways? And then I'm going to move on. But new compositions are really quite key. So that way, you might actually have 30 or 40 different photos of a single aurora event. You are going to likely take variations with slower and slower shutter speeds, especially as the aurora starts to pop more and more. I will try to dial my ISO down as far as I can. Remember, the lowest ISO is always the best. We shoot at those high ISOs because we have to let in more light. But as you get more and more light, because the aurora is brighter, I'm sort of constantly balancing, do I lower my shutter speed and get more definition in the aurora, or do I lower my ISO and get a better quality shot? Honestly, I'd be lying if I told you there was a perfect way. It's a little bit of a mental puzzle and balance. And that's why I try to take as many photos as possible because I might lower my ISO for one and then bump it back up and lower my shutter speed for the next. And just constantly thinking, how can I take this shot in as many different ways in the next 15, 20 minutes as possible? And then since your camera's on a tripod, set a timer and get in there. You know, if you're focused on that igloo, if you're focused on that Inukshuk, you don't have to try to achieve focus of yourself. You just run in there, stand next to that object, stay really, really still for 15 seconds, and you get a great little self-portrait. So I really, really enjoy that. I often get the question of full moon and aurora. So full moon for astrophotography is really challenging. You don't want the full moon, but for aurora, it actually it's really quite good. So I don't have a strong, you know, no moon is the best or full moon is the best. I think they're all just different types of shots. And I wanted to show you this shot because this is nearly a full moon, and you notice how you still get the aurora, but it provides this nice, really, really soft light. So I don't have to have that external flashlight like those little boxes I showed you. The moon does it, and the moon is the biggest, softest white box in the world, so it provides this really nice, even exposure, and I quite like those photos. The other thing I wanted to show you is this chart here, and if you'll see, I'm just circling. You can Google moonrise calendar for wherever you're going. You know, if you're going to Churchill, if you're going to Iceland, if you're going to Fairbanks, you can Google it for whatever, and just you type in the date and you search it and you find it. You can see here's for February 2026, and you'll start to notice, you know, a full moon here being denoted in the far left-hand corner of just that open circle. You'll notice that day to day, it changes a lot. So unless you're dead on the full moon, like your trip has a couple days before and a couple days after the full moon, you're likely to get the full experience. Like if we were to start a trip, for instance, on the second or third, notice how we're getting later and later with that moonrise. That means on February 5th at 8 p.m., we have no moon. That's as dark a sky as you can possibly get, and we routinely get aurora at that time of night. So it just kind of goes to show you that it's not all what you might think it is. It's not like, oh, full moon will yield this, new moon will yield this. It's very, very very much in flux. And that all being said, full moon and aurora is a really cool photo. It doesn't wash out the stars, or at least it doesn't wash out the aurora like it does with stars. You do still see stars here, and I think there's something beautiful about it because let's be frank, not a whole lot of people are photographing aurora. Fewer people are photographing aurora and full moon because it is a very, very specific time of month that you have to target, and it looks different but familiar all at the same time, right? It's like this familiar celestial body mixed with this really weird otherworldly, you know, explosion of oxygen and nitrogen, right? Okay, so I want to talk about processing, i.e., photo editing considerations, and I'm not going to spend a long time here, but I am going to go over some of the really key elements. So again, I shoot in RAW. That's super duper important. For every photo that I process of anything nighttime, I am going to adjust white balance, brightness, saturation, and I'm probably going to reduce the noise or use a noise reduction software. I'm just going to give you a few examples here. This is 100% where the art really comes in. So I cannot say that one is better than the other. You might have your favorites. Another person on the line might have their favorites. I might have my favorite, and they might be all different. But nevertheless, it does change the color. Notice there's more greens in one, more yellows in one. There's more blues and a different hue of green in the other. Saturation. Um, do you like really colorful, popping, saturated photos, or do you like it to look a little bit more muted? So these are just differences here. Brightness. Do you want to accentuate the fact that this is in the middle of the night, or do you want to make a little bit more vibrant, a little bit more popping of color with a little bit of brightness there? Again, there's not a perfect way to do it, but these things are possible when you shoot in RAW. And the same thing goes with all those things for astrophotography, but the one I really, really pay attention to, like I'll actually spend some real time on it, is white balance. Because if you notice on the left, this is a much more warm white balance, like a yellow. And then on the right, it's a much more cool or a blue-white balance. This is one, I'll just tell you, like I do have a preference for the cooler blue. I think it brings out the colors and the difference in colors a little bit better of the Milky Way. But again, this is where art comes in. Okay, so I promised you I'd talk a little bit more about lenses for these two main scenarios. So we're always kind of faced with, do you go with an ultra fast lens or an ultra wide lens? So for astrophotography, my top recommendation is to go ultra fast first and then as wide as you can second, which means in this case, I would choose the one on the left. 24 millimeters, not as wide as I'd like, but I have to have that f1.4. For Northern Lights, I choose the other way because I don't need that f1.4. You're going to get plenty of light with the settings at an f2.8 lens. And you're going to notice because the aurora is so beautiful when it streams across the entire sky, you really want to have an ultra wide lens. So generally for Northern Lights, I go for ultra wide first, super fast second. Again, astro fast first, then wide second. But if there's ever a time in history where you should pay attention to what your camera manufacturer is pumping out, now is the time because they are coming out with lenses probably faster and better and more interesting than ever before. And so now we're starting to see these lenses, probably because of how many photographers are enjoying these types of photography, that you get to have your cake and eat it too. So now Canon, my platform, has a 20 millimeter f1.4 that I'm really hoping to pick up. Got to save my pennies for that one. Sony has maybe my dream lens, which is a combination of both, a 14 millimeter f1.8. So you're getting better and better lenses that are not necessarily more expensive than their counterparts. They're just more tooled to this nighttime photography. So it's definitely worth paying attention to. Okay, promised you I'd tell you how to photograph the moon. This is pretty simple, and it all revolves around underexposing your shot considerably and using a telephoto. So telephoto, obviously, to zoom into it, and then f8 to get the texture. The moon is plenty bright. You don't have to worry about light like you are with stars and with Milky Way and with aurora. You zoom in and fill the frame as much as you can with the moon, and you manually darken, meaning in your exposure compensation meter, just darken the heck out of it to like -2 stops, -3 stops, dark, 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 and you're going to get that color, you're going to get that texture and get that contrast each and every time. But underexposure is the key. Severely underexposure shots if you want to shoot the moon this way. Other ways you can do it is putting it in the landscape, and you're going to still underexpose very likely because you do want to expose for the moon, and the moon is a very bright object in the sky. But here, what I love about using a telephoto in a landscape for the moon is what's known as zoom compression. And essentially, what one would do in this scenario is you'd actually be quite far away from that mountain range, like even further than the photo looks, yet you're going to be zoomed in to like 400 millimeters, 500 millimeters, as far as you can go, because as it magnifies the mountain to make it look like you're next to the mountain, it also magnifies the moon. It makes you look a lot closer to the moon. So these types of shots, we see them in magazines, we see them in photo tutorials, and they look like they're photoshopped and fake, but they're really not. It's just a technique known as zoom compression, where you put some sort of landscape feature in your shot, but then you zoom into it. Could be a tree, in this case, could be a person. Again, not photoshopped, but this is someone standing very, very far away from that human, not with an iPhone, very, very, very far away using like 600 millimeters. And again, it magnifies both. The person looks normal size, but the moon looks supersized, and it's awesome. So there are other types of night photography that are super fun on a lot of adventure travel trips around the world. And they're going to have very, very similar settings to what we just talked about, but significantly less restrictive. So we're going to talk about how to get some of these shots now. And this is a great thing to do to practice in your own backyard, to practice in your neighborhood if you are prepping for one of these types of trips. So what do we notice here? Well, the first thing is that much faster of a shutter speed, which frankly I love because I think I get really impatient waiting for a 25-second exposure each and every time. But if your shutter only has to be a second, it's really quick to have a sort of iterative process here and get better and better photos within 10 minutes. So just in the backyard with a picnic, here we are in the Kalahari Desert of Botswana with a lovely little candlelit evening. We're still using those shallow depths of field, those small F numbers to let in a lot of light, but we're also not using a super long shutter and then very, very similar ISOs. And I do recommend, this time, this blue hour, as I've noted here, it's that time about 20 minutes after the sun physically sets, and you get some really, really nice color in the sky. As exemplified here, here we are at the little viewpoint at Bear Camp at the Lake Clark National Park in Alaska. And the whole sky and atmosphere takes on this lovely blue hue. And the great thing is every single place on planet Earth has a blue hour. It's not just Botswana. It's not just Alaska. It's your own backyard too. And if you start paying attention to it, it's one would call it twilight. It's essentially after the sun has gone down. So you don't get that orange. You don't get that bright ball of fire in the sky. Instead, you're getting this really nice ambient cool look. So if you wish, practice makes perfect. If you want to do some practice in your own backyard, I think this is the best thing you can do to set up for your next photo trip. It's probably as important, if not more important, than getting, the perfect gear. But setting up at sunset, you get the light, you can see where you're going, you can figure out the angles, and then just start practicing on these manual settings. Start seeing what the difference between a 10-second exposure and a 25-second exposure is. See how quickly you can get that 2-second timer on. Experiment with the focusing techniques. I'll tell you that it's a hard enough focusing technique as is. What makes it harder is doing it for your first time under a screaming aurora or a perfect Milky Way in Grand Canyon. So doing it ahead of time is really, really great. And then actually taking it one step further and editing on the computer to play around. Note, what are the capabilities? Can I significantly lighten this? Oh, I can. Therefore, I can probably even shoot darker than I need to because of the settings, et cetera, et cetera. So seeing it all the way through and messing around with the editing, I think is really, really helpful too, just to know how much leeway you have on the back end of it while so it really sets you up for taking the photo even better. Okay, so second to last slide here, just a little plug for naturalphotographer.org, NatHab's photo tutorial website. I mentioned one of my most recent articles talks about various types of focusing techniques for northern lights. You can see that article there. And with that, I will thank you so much, and I'm sure I've got some questions.
All right. Thank you so much, Court. Now, before we dive into the question and answer session, I would like to remind everyone that if you do have questions, you can submit them via the question field in your control panel. Just go to the upper right-hand corner and click on those three lines up there. We call that the hamburger. Open up that hamburger and click on down to questions, and that's where you can submit them. So let's get to these questions. So when we're out there on the Churchill trip, are we going to have to worry about any ambient light from the tundra buggy while we're taking photographs?
No, almost definitely not. Now, if you're talking about the Churchill Northern Lights trip, they're usually different viewing locations almost every night. And I will say that some of the cabins, some of the teepees will be at, you actually want to get in your frame because that soft glowing light of a fire inside the teepee or the warm light from a window of a cabin is a really great thing to achieve that focus I was talking about. It makes it really easy. And it's also a great foreground element. Like, how cool is it? Like this log cabin in the woods with the aurora overhead. Yes, get some shots of just the trees in the aurora, perfectly natural, but get a sense of place too. So definitely no issues with polar rovers. If you're talking about on our polar bear trips, which you may, generally no, you would have all lights off in the rover. If the aurora came out, then no, all lights would be off. Yeah, absolutely.
Great, thank you so much. Um, so if you focus on the foreground object and then put it on manual, won't the Milky Way or aurora be a little out of focus?
Um, Potentially. However, I'll throw the question back: Is wouldn't you rather the gaseous waving aurora to be a little out of focus versus your foreground element being a little out of focus? Right? Like that's the crux of it, is that you want something in the foreground to give your photo, like this example photo here, like some definition, some sharpness, some context. But if that's blurred and those stars are a little bit more round and pointy, like which one would you rather have? So I would always prefer to have my foreground element in focus. There's a couple ways around this. One is technically, if you go to like f2.8 or even f4, that should solve the problem. but let's just say you can't and you have to shoot at like f1.4, or let's just say f2.8, still not cutting it. What you can do, as an example, you're in the boreal forest in Canada for our Northern Lights trip, and let's say you're in front of the trees. Trees are your foreground element. Aurora is streaming overhead, and you find that the aurora is out of focus. What you could do is just back up a little bit, meaning like 10, 15 feet, just to put those trees a little bit further away from you, and you might find that you get to have your cake and eat it too. That all being said, the aurora is kind of an amorphous thing anyway. Like you can't really achieve tack sharp focus because it's never going to be like really defined. It's very wispy. It's very out of focus. So I don't generally find that to be an issue. But going back to the first part is that um, if you have one slightly out of focus, I think it looks way better to have the Milky Way just a touch out of focus versus the mountain, the rock, the tree, because the rock and the tree is the first thing people look. And I do think it's kind of like with wildlife photography. If the eyes aren't in focus, anybody looking at that photo senses there's something off. It unfortunately dials it down from like a really great photo, just like why does this not look real sharp? Whereas again, foreground focus each and every time works for me. But I could stand to be corrected, but that's just my philosophy on it.
Gotcha. Thank you for sharing that. So, so would you say that is it possible that night photography is a bigger strain on your batteries, and how do you keep from running through battery life when you're constantly photographing at night?
Yeah, it's a good question because it's like it's it seems as if it would be hard, right? But it really isn't. Like, to be honest, like even in Churchill in the extreme cold, like I'll maybe go through two batteries a night and I'm in minus 40 degrees. I'm shooting shot after shot after shot, and maybe I'll change my batteries once. So, just to avoid not taking up too much time, and like you think it would be, but it's really not, fortunately. That being said, bring two extra batteries and you should be just fine. But yeah, fortunately, it's not that big of a problem.
Do you have any tips for video photography of auroras?
Yeah. Okay. So here's the plain truth is that 99.5% of videos you've seen of the aurora are time lapses. They're not actual in the moment videos, except my Northern Lights video tutorial that is on our YouTube channel for Natural Habitat. It was the first time I was with our video team that our cameras were sensitive enough to actually pick up in the moment low light videography. Because so here's the thing is when you shoot video, you have to shoot at basically 1/25th of a second, right? Because you're shooting essentially 25 photos per second, and then the camera's putting them all together into a motion picture, right? So because you can't shoot slower than 1/25th of a second, or else you wouldn't get 25 frames in your second of video, you have to have crazy high ISO capabilities. And we just happen to have this camera with us that was known as a dual sensitivity ISO, and we were shooting at like 25,600 ISO. So that's the exception. The vast majority are time lapses. If you wish to know more on that, shoot us an email and I'll get back to you personally. I'll give you some tips on how to do that. It is almost an entirely other webinar, so I unfortunately can't answer it with sounding good at all right now. It's doable, but the vast majority are all time lapses, just to be totally honest.
Great. Thank you, Court. So to reduce movement, can you set the camera to delayed shutter release?
Yes. Yeah, that's 100% what I'm doing. That 2 second delay is essentially buying yourself 2 seconds from the moment you press it, 1/1000, 2/1000 photo takes. So yeah, 100% delay release is my go-to.
Do you ever use a remote trigger?
I do. I kind of covered this, and like they're pretty darn helpful, and they're nice, and especially if you want to sit down over here, yet have your camera set up, and you're like, oh, from moment to moment, I want to be able to actuate the shutter. They are nice, but again, I've had them fail in the field too many times that I wouldn't count on them. But yeah, sort of. I'm over the days where you have a cable release. Like those things, they're just not enough upside versus the downside. The Bluetooth remote triggers that you can stand like 30 feet away are kind of cool because you can go, sit on this tree stump over here while your camera's, tucked into the trees in 2 feet of snow. But it's not a core part of my kit. I'll put it that way. The 2 second release is really quite nice.
So, would you say that used lenses are risky or reliable?
Depends on the person you're buying it from, but I've always had really great success with it. I've purchased a lot of used lenses. Um, you know, take it as seriously as you think it should be taken. Like you want to make sure it's good. If you're buying it off of Craigslist or Facebook Marketplace, like bring your camera body, ask if you can photograph around with it in the parking lot of the grocery store or wherever you're, making the exchange, and take it pretty seriously. Look for scratches, ask them if there's anything wrong with it. But again, with some discerning due diligence, I've had great luck. And I've also sold a lot of lenses that I take really great care of over the years. And so when I make investments in a lot of these lenses, I might sell them 5 or 6 years later for like 70 or 80% of what I bought them for. And that's a pretty good deal, pretty good investment when you think of the return on that and using it expedition over expedition. So yes, I do think the used lens market is fantastic, but be careful with the product.
Great, thanks for that advice. So, have you incorporated star trackers into your camera bag to extend your exposure times? And if so, do you have any you recommend?
Oh, that's a great question. No, I haven't. So a star tracker, this is brilliant for everyone else in the audience, is it literally will track the rotation of the Earth, so you can take longer than 25-second exposures, and or you can take time lapses of the Earth's rotation with the Milky Way in it. Um, yeah, to be honest, it's not anything I've ever dabbled with because so often I'm guiding these trips, I really just don't have like that would almost take another level of diligence out there to set it up and track it and make sure everything's going perfectly. I'm usually helping other people with their cameras more, so I have time for like a quick couple of shots. But I love the question, and no, I don't know any brands. I would say, yeah, just go on reviews, and it probably is one of those things that you're going to get what you pay for. It's a relatively advanced technology when you think about it, like being able to, with perfect Swiss watch accuracy, track the movement of the Earth so there's no bounce back and forth. Yeah, I'd probably invest in the good one if I was serious about it.
Great, thanks. So, if I'm gonna come on a photography trip with NatHab, do I need a really fancy camera? Does NatHab rent camera gear, or is my iPhone gonna be good enough?
Yeah, it's a great question. It kind of depends on which trip we're talking about. You can do so much with iPhones these days. They're absolutely extraordinary. I would say a lot of trips, the creativity, the composition, the lighting, the storytelling can all be achieved by the very best camera in the world, which is, as I always say, the one you have with you. That's the best camera in the world. I would say for night photography stuff, if you wish to get anything like I'm showing here, where it's like you can blow it up, you can edit it. It is really high resolution. It's not pixely. Then you're gonna want a fancier camera. If you're talking about, a trip to, oh gosh, I don't know, like let's just say our polar bear trip, for instance, most people will have iPhones on those trips. The only downside is that, well, when I say iPhones, I mean smartphones. The only downside is that the zoom or telephoto capabilities aren't that good, but they are getting better. Like the 5 times telephoto that's now on a lot of smartphones. I know Google has like a 15 or a 20x times. They're getting pretty darn good. If you're thinking about joining, one of our photo expeditions, it not prohibited whatsoever. You will probably be around a lot of people talking about apertures and f-stops and shutter speeds with bigger, like bazooka-like lenses. So just keep that in mind that the group dynamic will be a little bit different. But as far as what you can capture, no, there's no requirements for what kind of camera you have. And unfortunately, we don't rent cameras, but I know we have a great deal with lensrentals.com. It's just all one word. I use them a lot. And if you use the code NATHAB15, you do get 15% off. NATHAB15.
Great, Court. We really appreciate that. Unfortunately, that is going to be the last question that we do have time for today. So, I'd like to hand it back to you for some closing comments.
Cool. Well, gosh, thanks so much for joining. I loved revisiting these photos. These are some of like truly my greatest moments in life is being out here under the stars, under the aurora, photographing, and I really enjoyed sharing with you today. So hopefully you learned a thing or two, and maybe see you in the field sometime.
Court, thank you so much for taking the time to present for us today. And I'd also like to thank everyone who tuned in today. So if you are interested in information on how you can take a photo trip with NatHab, please give us a call at the number on your screen, or you can send us an email at info@nathab.com. Our adventure specialists are happy to help you out. If you're part of a photo club and would like NatHab to speak to your members about nature and travel photography, email us at webinars@nathab.com. Join us tomorrow for our next daily dose of nature. You can check out this week's lineup, including registration links, on our website at nathab.com/webinars. We did record today's presentation, and we will have the replay available on our website soon. With that, I will conclude the webinar. Goodbye, everybody. We will see you next time.